Welcome to Earth Central, everybody. I'm very excited for everybody who's listening to our episode today. Um, Today we have a guest who we're looking a little bit towards the future with. And by that, I mean we have young inspirational professionals, or we have a young inspirational professional here whose engagement, I think, is on a great path to make the planet a better place. Um, his name is Hikaru Wakil Hayakawa, and he is an entrepreneur and an activist. He is the executive director and co-founder of Climate Cardinals, a major youth-led climate group with over 16,000 volunteers, I believe, in 134 countries. And he has created its translation program with support from Translators Without Borders and Google Cloud. And in 2023, the group became one of the first youth-led organizations to receive six-figure funding from Google's philanthropic arm. So we're very excited to talk always about interesting, new, off-the-ground things that are actually working in the sustainability sector. And so we're super happy to have you, Hikaru, and thanks for giving us your time, first of all.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for having me, Alex.
So to start with, the same thing that I like to do with all of my guests, if you can provide a little bit of a background of yourself, and kind of your personal journey. First of all, how your path led you to co-found Climate Cardinals, and anything else that you've done on that path that you feel like is worth mentioning.
Yeah, of course. No, I love that question. So, yeah, I am a now 24-year-old as of a few days ago, Guyanese and Japanese American climate activist. I grew up in the New York metro area, like the son of immigrants. And so within my family, we had a lot of people who were community leaders. And so my great grandfather, who helped raise my mom, like he owned a supermarket, and like within the supermarket he would always like gather like local organizers in Guyana who were like focused on labor issues. And so basically, like from when I was growing up, I always really cared about social issues. And I was also in a family where I had different family members who'd go out and say and see like something in their community, and then they would do their best to act on it. And so basically, from when I was 11, I was involved in community organizing. And so basically, during that time, there were a lot of different racial justice issues going on in my community. And so I got involved with local organizations. And then throughout my childhood, of course, there was a huge intersection between like racial justice and environmental issues. And so that's how I started to get more involved in the environmental movement, as I saw how environmental issues disproportionately affect communities that are vulnerable to other issues too. And so I also grew up in a very multilingual household, and so I mean my parents speak different languages, and so basically when I was 18. I had found about Climate Cardinals, and then basically I joined the founding team. And so Sophia was the one who originally came up with the idea. And then like when I heard it, I was like, oh yeah, it's amazing. Like I can see like the issue of language accessibility in my own family and in like the communities that I'm a part of. Basically, how a large proportion of climate information is only available in English, even though the vast majority of the world doesn't speak English at all, and how this is a huge barrier in terms of access to basic climate science. It's also an issue in terms of knowing what to do when there are disasters, or receiving emergency alerts, or if something happens to your house, your property, like where do you go? Like how do you apply for insurance? And so we started translating climate information for our families and our communities. And then this is at the beginning of the pandemic, so it was the summer before college for all of us. Um, and basically when like a team member created a reel, and then it went viral, and then all of a sudden there were thousands of volunteers from around the world. And so we were just a bunch of high school students, like this was a small project. And so when I was coming on, I was just kind of figuring out what to do. Definitely did not expect to work with that many volunteers all at the same time. And so basically, what I did with our team was just reach out to a bunch of organizations, try to learn from the people who were doing the work the best, and we built systems with translators at borders and other partners to really like streamline how we were dealing or like coordinating volunteers. And then from then, just kept on doing our work. We were Sophia was asked to advise UN Secretary General. We had other team members advising UNESCO and the World Health Organization. And then when we were juniors, Google reached out, and then we started partnering with them. And then after our partnership, they were like, "Hey, like, do you need support to run the organization full time?" And so that's how I've ended up working full time for Climate Cardinals. It's been such an amazing journey. And beyond that, on the side, I was also doing a lot of different projects with the UN and indigenous organizations. I also briefly worked for tribal government and then worked for think tank in the EU. So very much all over the environmental space.
I think there are like some super basic questions first that like spring from all of this, that just to learn a little bit more about your person. First of all, you mentioned that obviously your parents spoke different languages, and you had all these different cultural influences growing up. Like, how many languages do you speak actually?
I speak well. I speak four, but I speak Macedonian, and so a lot of the people who've lived in the Balkans, like they kind of cheat because if you know one of the Balkan language, one of the Western Balkan languages, you can claim that you speak six or seven. Um, so basically four: so English, Spanish, Macedonian, and Russian, and then I have some understanding of Japanese and German.
Wow. Yeah, that's very impressive. I mean, yeah, I like to I speak like two languages fluently, and then I speak like a bunch of languages, sort of somewhere between 70% and like 5%. I think that's like, I feel like that's a fair estimate. Like, my French has suffered over the years. My Spanish is all right. Like, we could have the conversation in Spanish probably. Like, maybe not as fluently, but I think I would sort of manage to muddle through it. But then the other ones, I always need to refresh. So that's super cool. And they're very diverse families, like language families too. So you really like have covered a lot of different branches of the language tree. That's really cool. And the other thing is, I mean, I understand from the background and what we're going to get into that you're obviously traveling a lot too, probably. But like, where is actually home for you at the moment?
Yeah, so I'm based in New York, and so Climate Cardinals is an office here, but our team is hybrid. So we also have team members in other places around the world.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I can empathize with your background a little bit, because the interesting thing is, around the time, like you said, you're 24, right? And when I used to be a student in international conflict resolution, and at that time, I actually, yeah, I was super interested in understanding more about conflicts and history of different places around the world. So like I studied Asian history for a while, so especially Japanese history, Chinese history, and a little bit of different hotspots in Southeast Asia, like the Philippines, for example. And then Africa as well. Like, we had a really great program that was had this really amazing case study about Uganda and Eastern Africa, and I spent some time working in Kenya. Anyway, and that is what got me interested in sustainability, because so you saw it more from a like social justice perspective, and I mean that's sort of related, right? But for me, like the factors, like the environmental factors that actually lead to conflict around the world, they can lead to civil wars, they can lead to migration, and then that creates a lot of other social issues as well. So I think, yeah, it's super interesting, and we could probably have a whole conversation for hours about those sort of things, regionally, locally. But today we talk about sustainability, and we talk, of course, about the kind of innovative and promising solutions. And that's kind of the core of this podcast. And so it's super exciting to have you on, and have like this concept of Climate Cardinals that you co-founded, and you already started to talk about it. But can you give us a little bit of a rundown of the organization, like the main purpose, and sort of, from founding it to where you see it now, and also where you maybe see it going in the future? That's like a three-pronged question, but I'll let you answer it any way you'd like, seem fit.
Yeah, of course. So, no, thanks for the question. Also, super cool to hear about your background, all the languages, and definitely, yeah, we do another podcast episode in Spanish. Um, but uh, but yeah, so in terms of Climate Cardinals, so yeah, as mentioned, yeah, we originally a group of children of immigrants based in the U.S., and we saw in our own families like how language access was a huge issue, and so for many different reasons. And so we started primarily with translating climate information, like we were resourcing scientific information, but we also expanded. So really partnering with organizations of communities that have relationships with communities on the ground to figure out what's the most important. And so whether that's like disaster preparedness materials, so we had a collaboration with Yale where we were translating, disaster preparedness materials for Latinx communities in the U.S. We had another partnership with UNICEF where we were translating their Children's Climate Risk Index that they were using to train youth empowerment professionals on the ground on how climate change affects education. And so these are just some examples of our earlier work. And then over time, we also realized that we can make an even greater impact by not just translating climate information, but really working to empower like representative youth from these communities, because this is like a very large proportion of the world. 6.5 billion people don't speak English at all. And so there's a huge barrier when it comes to accessing information. Also, I recently saw a research paper about the equivalent of the IPCC report that the UN produces on climate change for biodiversity. And basically, that report was saying that I think 95% of the sources that were used for the report were in English or were from English language sources, which, that's less than 20% of the global population. Also, among the 20%, I think, 7% overall are native English speakers. And so, yeah, just a huge barrier. And so, yeah, so we both translate climate information, but we also empower representative youth through two different programs. We have about 180 chapters, 71% of them are in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. And basically, they're localizing climate education to meet community needs. So they're doing like workshops, disaster preparedness, and they're also doing advocacy. Then we also have a fellowships program where we train youth in nonprofit operations and strategic change making. And so that's what we do overall. And that's where we're at right now. And then moving forward, we see this like incredible opportunity because, we're now in 134 countries. We have this very diverse network that can really expand access to the climate movement because, there are so many regions where like these conversations have been limited, and also how they interact with the global conversation has been limited because of language barriers. Um, and so we see a lot of opportunity right now, especially because there's a lot of uncertainty about where the climate movement is going right now. But like we're seeing that people really want to get involved. Like we just launched an ambassadors program last week, and we got over 400 signups in under 4 hours. And so people are looking for opportunities to take action in their communities. And so, moving forward, we really want to scale deep with what we already have to activate this network all around the world to really rebuild momentum for climate and also to lead projects that strengthen communities and to ensure that like there are leaders in those communities who are connected within global networks so they can share ideas and resources. And so they can lead both now, but also for the years to come and really make a difference in like this overall vision of like climate resilience for all communities around the world.
This is so interesting. For me, what you said at the beginning of this, it's something, it's remarkable. Like, the fact that the vast majority of the information, in the documentation, that deals with these really critical questions, like in the IPCC reports and things like that. That's all, or the vast majority of it, English language based. So on one hand, like I'm not surprised, but on the other hand, the implication, right? Like everything that's left out, because to me, it's not only that it's not understandable for a lot of people, but it also means that it's missing an incredible amount of perspective
Yeah.
when we're having this debate, right? Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, no, of course. I mean, yeah, you're so right. I mean, yeah, there's the issue of access to information, but there's also the issue that like we want all of our global decision making to reflect the entire world, but really we don't know what a lot of the world thinks. Most of the people who have decision making responsibilities aren't able to get that information, and there are like communities in non English speaking countries that have ideas and solutions, but they can't actually scale their ideas because they can't apply to grants. There are a lot of grants that just aren't available in other languages. I think the issue is that like capital might not necessarily reach a lot of these countries because, of course, both philanthropy and capital are concentrated in the global north and in English-speaking countries. I think about 65% of philanthropy is within the U.S. And I think like there aren't research papers on this, but I believe that if you also look at the UK and Australia and other English-speaking countries, it gets close to like 80 to 85%. And so you have this issue where like, yeah, like maybe there are some re-granting institutions in these regions that can help scale solutions, but really like a lot of the philanthropy is just going to these other countries. And I have a friend who leads the Climate Justice Fund, and he recently gave a TED talk and pointed out that I believe that Norway receives more grant funding than any developing country when it comes to research on developing countries.
Wow. That's yeah, super interesting. I mean, there is a lot there to unpack. Like I remember, like one of the issues that sort of followed the period of colonialism around, like in Africa, for example, is sort of like also this like loss of history. So like it's this kind of reminds me of this statistic that like the vast majority of artifacts and things like that from pre-colonial times you can find in museums in London, for example, or in these other places. And so it's also just really difficult for post-colonial societies to reconnect with their history and the roots. And the same is true for this kind of information. So on the one hand, I feel like my impression, I mean, I've never been at these conferences or anything like that, but my impression is there is um, often this sort of um, expectation that countries from around the world, um, yeah, we like to say in the Western world, like democratize and pull their weight. But the thing is that if you have this unevenness in information flow, you cannot really expect a country's population that has a lot less information accessible to them to support the same measures. I think if they're not even, if they're much more difficult to communicate to the population because there's a lot fewer resources in any given language. So that's super fascinating to me. And one of the things we do at Orbify in a different way that you do, but what is really important for us is we work a lot with open data, right? And open data is also a way to democratize information, because it's open and it's not just proprietary data in our platforms. Um, and uh, I would bet that while that is true, we probably also have the vast majority of the data science information on that field is presumably also in English language and in Western language sources. And so that's super, super interesting. And I feel like even in the day and age of AI, and we can get into that a little bit later, I feel like that's still a huge obstacle actually to a lot of the progress that would technically be possible. Um, Yeah. So back to Climate Cardinals though. You know, what one of the things you mentioned is like in the early stages, you were already working with some pretty um, big partners. And you know, we're also in a different way, but we're in a startup space, so it's inspiring to hear in different areas too. How did you manage, you know, to get the attention and to partner up with like Google Cloud and you mentioned like UNICEF and some others. Like how you know at an early stage, how do you get to that point?
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, there's so much there. Also, that your point on data and AI is also very related to like to what we do too. I mean, I think there's this whole issue in terms of like needing to support research that are coming from non-English speaking communities because that's part of the imbalance. Um, and also how like I mean, it's changing with AI now, but of course, like the areas like non-English speaking communities and countries are disproportionately affected by climate change, but they're also the areas where the data quality is the poorest. And AI, of course, is making some advances there, but also part of the issue is that there hasn't been as much support for like training researchers like from those regions. But to your point of yeah, us also yeah, like I mean, we're also very much a startup. I hope that we're I think exiting startup mode now, and that you know things are a lot more structured and everything. But when it comes to actually working with these larger partners, I mean, I think there are a lot of different things going on. One was that we were able to we had like an amazing team that was able to communicate effectively, and the other one was about really building trust like with personal relationships. And I think that you know that's something that I just learned through the process, and I didn't realize how important like trust is professionally, just in terms of like having conversations with people, getting to know them until and like you know people will often make decisions whether or not to partner with you, whether or not to fund you, like based on your relationship with them and like whether you're willing to be transparent or like whether you have knowledge about the issues because you're speaking to other people or whether you're looking for advice and feedback. And then also in terms of the communications part, yeah, we were just able to like we just had something. Well, we had a very specific mission, and we didn't realize how many people cared about it. And we were luckily able to get like tons of very talented youth involved, and so they were just very effective in communicating all the work we're doing and how important it was to the point where you had these institutions coming to us and like, oh, like we should also be doing that. And then we're like, yes, like you should be doing that. And so like that, I mean, I think that was incredible to see like how, you know, just communicating something could change how institutions function. Where now you had different UN agencies reaching out to us and saying like, you know, we need to make sure that we're translating climate information. We had the same conversation with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in the US,
Yeah.
the institution that, of course, publishes tons of climate data and also does weather forecasting and everything. And then they also had a program where they partnered with a tech company to translate weather alerts. Although unfortunately the contract just ended, but that's hopefully something that is a model for other governments around the world, and also something that can be restarted again in the future in the U.S. And so, yeah, basically, trust and communication is where we started, and I think that you know people really believed in us because you know we were just a bunch of teenagers at the time in the beginning, and so we didn't really have any ulterior motive. Like we just wanted to do the best that we could, and then we found out that you know you can just like it's just as simple as speaking out and just taking action in your communities. Like none of us were professional translators. We learned in the process. We're able to build out effective systems for translating climate information and really doing like campaigns all around the world about the importance of this issue.
Yeah, I mean, I'm getting from it a little bit that like the youthful spirit and the energy really helped. In this case, and I have first one question, a quick one, about this is like is everyone involved in Climate Cardinals a very young person?
Well, we're always happy to partner with older people. We need intergenerational partnerships, but yes, basically, I think one of our oldest team members is 28, and then most of the average age of our volunteer when we started was 15. Now it's 21.
This is really encouraging to me because um, I remember, I worked in some of the fields where also international organizations, the UN, the UNEP, for example, have played a role. And often, I think one of the things that you find, or that the impression you get, is that these organizations that are so established and like kind of paper tigers in some ways and stuff, they can seem quite like tone deaf and stuff. But your story, seems like they actually had an ear for the voice of young people. So maybe you can give us some hope there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that people are people everywhere, and then when you start to have a conversation, when you start to show that you're interested in speaking, getting to know each other, that people are really willing to listen. And I think that there are a lot of debates and conflicts within the broader social and like political sphere. And then part of the issue too is that we just sometimes use very different language to speak about the same issue. And I've worked with organizations in the private sector, in the public sector, UN agencies, government officials, social justice activists, and sometimes we're all speaking about the same thing. It's just like that's also something I tell our team is that language is not just like about separate languages. Also, like some sectors in industries like have different ways of speaking about the same thing.
Man, I wish I could like hire you as a consultant, because we have like what my job is to what you just said is like it's such a nugget, because I think this is totally true at the large scale and at very specific smaller scales too. The fact that we try to say the same thing but we speak different languages, even if we all speak English, is so true. Like, I try to communicate about very specific regulations and methodologies. Like, one is in the net zero and in the nature based solution sector, and the other one is in the EUDR, the European Deforestation Regulation. And there's a lot happening right now in both of these sectors, or for us at Orbify, they're verticals because they're our business verticals. But my job is to kind of bridge the information in my role. Um, and of course, we want to talk to the corporate side of things. We want to talk to the sustainability managers, to the CEOs, but we also need to convey the message of the regulators. Our product only works as a translating tool, essentially, between the two. And otherwise, no, we're never going to find any compliance, right? Because it has to be understandable for both sides immediately after using our platform. So our goal is really to translate in a way. And it's, of course, also to monitor and to analyze and to scrutinize, but it is also to translate. And I find this such an interesting challenge, and I've encountered it in science communication in general, in a lot of different fields and different facets of the sustainability debate, especially. Um, do you have any words of wisdom? How you feel that what has helped you um, to communicate effectively with different stakeholders, I guess.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think part of it is just like having a lot of different experience across sectors. So I was very used to speaking to people who, yeah, have very different language and like values systems and everything, and they care about different things. Um, and so, for example, like when speaking about climate risk, like climate risk, of course, is super important in the private sector. If you're speaking about it from the activist perspective, you might be speaking more about damages, about climate adaptation. They're very similar conversations, just using very different language. And then part of that too is that what was so great about Climate Cardinals was that it was this group of youth from all around the world coming with such different backgrounds And so there were people who had much more experience working in the private sector, a lot more experience working with activists. And so they also have really shaped our ability to communicate across different stakeholders where, we partner with Google, we partner with other, activist organizations. Like we also, yeah, we partnered with Deloitte, the Clinton Global Initiative, UN agencies. And so really building a very broad base of institutions that are willing to come behind this issue of language access. And so, I mean, I think in terms of like broader advice, I mean, I'd say, yeah, I mean, just like listening and learning. Yeah, I mean, I think just being willing to find like commonalities, um, and then I think something else is also like realizing that people have different values, and I think that's something that can be hard to get around. So, for example, like there have been a lot of different like conservative environmental organizations that have been established within the U.S. And people have asked me what my opinion is on them, and what I'll say honestly is like they're like these organizations are speaking to a different audience. And of course, they have to use different languages. Like the communities that they are speaking to have different values than when these more traditional climate organizations are speaking to broader activist communities. So of course, they're going to say different things, but then they're also building a broader coalition, even if we don't agree on everything. And so I think that's also one thing that, yeah, just to be aware that people do have different values, and I think that's one of the biggest barriers when it comes to like communications across the sector, but also when the sex like when people who work in climate want to speak to people who care about other issues or don't necessarily understand how climate affects their day-to-day lives.
That's super nice that you just said that, because that was my follow-up question, which kind of what you see as some of the biggest challenges in your pursuit. If you want to add something else, feel free.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that there are a lot of different. So when it comes to like Climate Cardinals work in general, I think that one thing that I really appreciate about the private sector, this is a slightly different topic, but how like there's a very strong culture of like, well, I mean, there's so many startups and everything, and that there are a lot of like really very innovative organizations that are coming up with ideas, seeing what works. In the public sector or the nonprofit sector, there isn't necessarily that culture. There are not a lot of early stage organizations, and there are also not a lot of foundations that support early stage organizations. And so that's something where I'm thinking about, yeah, how can we learn about the private sector? How can we transfer this culture over? Because there honestly aren't that many youth led organizations that have sustainable budgets like year to year. And some youth led organizations are very old. Well, not super old, but 15 to 20 years old. And they operate in like hundreds of countries. And so, yeah, how can the nonprofit sector and the private sector learn from each other is something that I'm interested in right now, in like building that culture. And like, how can we see more youth led organizations come up and also be more sustainable? Because that's also a huge issue, because right now, a lot of support for youth led organizations is more communications related. So it's coming out of like corporate marketing budgets or the communications budget of UN agencies and government institutions, which of course, like youth are very effective communicators. They're tied to their families, their schools, to different organizations. People trust them. So of course, always happy to communicate these issues, but also I think there's a very strong need to really invest deeply in these organizations and in cross-sectoral collaborations so that we can continue all these initiatives for years to come.
I remember that you said earlier that you had sort of, in your case, when you started Climate Cardinals, you had a very clear mission, or like, yeah, right, like or vision, maybe is the. And I remember like I remember this Arnold Schwarzenegger speech I've seen somewhere, and he said, uh, once I had a, like, he talks about his early life and how he wanted to leave Austria and stuff, and he's like, once I had a vision, it was easy, because then I just needed to make it a reality or something like that. And that is like, even though it's in a way it's an activist organization, and it's certainly not a corporate thing you're doing, but that's almost like a that's what the corporate sector usually does best, right? They identify a niche, and they go for it, or that's at least the like. I think this is a lot more difficult often in the nonprofit sector. Um, yeah, can you just talk a little bit about, how you? I mean, you've already talked about the road there, but how it helped you maybe, to have like identified this thing and you could just go for it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I think that like the nonprofit sector and the private sector are a lot more similar than people in both sectors realize. And I think just having a lot of people who've worked in both spaces, I mean, I think that yeah, that like a lot of the like how you run a good business is also how you run a good nonprofit. Like you need to have a team, like a team that loves each other. Like you need to have a very clear vision. You need to have very clear strategies. You need to know like what you're doing, why you're doing it, how you're providing value to people. And like the only difference is that like nonprofits are supported primarily by philanthropy, and then in the private sector it's sales. Um, and so I think having a very clear vision from the beginning allowed us to really be clear on how like we're providing value to the overall climate movement, to the world, to communities. And so like when we were approaching institutions, like it was very like clear what what we wanted, and also just in terms of guiding like what we were doing day to day, like making sure that we were always like focused and that we didn't get caught up in everything, because there are a lot of youth led organizations that are doing really effective work, and if we were doing the same thing as all of them, then there wouldn't really be a reason for us to exist. And so I think just being very clear has really allowed us to keep on growing, and for people to understand, okay, like why should I volunteer for Climate Cardinals? And I think we've also been able to bring a lot of people into the movement because we showed that you could be a translator and be a climate activist. And same in the private sector. Like I've, I've met a lot of people at Deloitte, and then one of them was like, "Yeah, you can be an accountant and be a climate activist. You do carbon accounting," and like there are all these different ways to get involved. And I'm happy that Climate Cardinals has been a way in which a lot of people who weren't traditionally part of the movement could become a part of it.
Awesome. So, sorry, I had a question ready in my head. um, uh, on these on your translation and on your translation initiatives, um, one of the things that sort of comes to my mind, so I have it here written down, and you nodded earlier when I introduced you, like over 16,000 volunteers that are helping with translating climate information. It must be such an incredible challenge. And, I understand that, not everything needs to be perfect on the ground in these sort of situations, because it's really also about, I'm assuming, on a very grassroots level, right, to empower people. But how do you, ensure, like, how do you get these 16,000 people the tools? Like, can you talk a little bit about, the process? Like, how do you empower your people to empower others?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, it depends on the program, but in terms of how our translations work, so basically we have a dashboard that we run in partnership with Translators at Borders. And so that's how we coordinate everyone. So we're able to send out requests, and then people can claim requests, and then some requests are higher priority than others. And then basically they're like, you need to go through a brief training before you're onboarded onto the platform. And then there's always proofreaders involved at the end. So multiple people looking to document to really make sure that it's culturally appropriate. We've also worked with linguists to create a glossary. So basically, there are a lot of words in English to speak about climate that haven't necessarily been translated or standardized in other languages. And so we worked with linguists to make sure that we are actually transferring over the idea, because as you know, if you directly translate a word, it might not really make that much sense. It might not really be culturally appropriate. And then, yeah, in terms of our and then in terms of like how we design the translation program to make sure that it's effective, it's largely through like partnerships with organizations, with connections to communities, and that's how we know. Like we always ask them, okay, what are you going to use this for? How do you know that people want this? Because for a large part, we're providing this for free to all these organizations, and so basically, like we collect impact metrics around, okay, are people more prepared for disasters? Does this lead to some kind of outcome? And like in terms of advocacy, in terms of other programs, yeah, like we provide a lot of workshops and toolkits, while also understanding that people know their community best. So really, like providing them some tools that they can use in the grounds, but also they can like let us know. For example, for a chapters program, like we can support them with design. We give them access to like premium Zoom accounts, Monday.com accounts, like translated curricula, activist toolkits, and then like we'll try to connect them with mentors and everything, so they can really invest in their leadership skills, and then also bring them together with a global network so they can share best practices and ideas and everything. And so that's really our model for empowering youth to empower others. And so it's been really exciting to see where like one of our team members just created this video the other day, and then there were pictures from like Ivory Coast, from Nepal, from France. And then I was sitting there and I was like, five years ago, this was just like a bunch of high school students working from their bedrooms during the early days of the pandemic. And I was just like, this is crazy. But I think also shows that when you have a lot of determined youth who want to take action on something, that we can get things done.
Yeah, and that's something, I mean, I think it's an important message to young people, but also everybody else. Um, I mean, I love the story of Climate Cardinals so much because it is really, and the way you're telling it too, because it really is this, to me, when I see sort of the timeline, which, you know, and the impact and the amount, again, the partnerships and the just the sheer amount of people involved, and um I mean, it's such a great example, what's possible when you try. And and for me, that's also my answer to it. I'm going to ask you the question anyway. um do you encounter, because I mean, if you have all these young people that are super determined and are doing really impressive things, but have you also encountered like some challenges because of that? Because people at the end of the day, right, might be like, yeah, okay, but this is just a bunch of young people, like, I mean, you have a super impressive background, but I know from my experience when I was your age, it was not that easy to get everything across that I wanted, because people were like, yeah, but he's at the beginning uh, of his career. How, I mean, you're executive director, but have you encountered some difficulties with that, or not really?
I mean, at the beginning, yes. Now, not so much. I mean, I think that like we just have such a great team, and they're so determined, and like we're so lucky because they're so young. Because if all our volunteers were already working, they already would have been like directors within companies and all these other things. And so yeah, I mean, yeah, we just developed a reputation for like commitment to excellence and just really wanting to get things done well and like thoughtfully. But yeah, definitely at the beginning, like we were just reaching out to all these organizations, would not hear anything. And then we're like, okay, so like we'll just translate climate information on our own. And then once we started like having it on our website, like sending it out to organizations, they're like, oh wow, like this is good. Like, do you want to do more? And so, and then, but like there are ways in which you kind of have to overcompensate. Like it's really funny, as my friends always joke, because like I wear a suit very often, and like that's on purpose, of course, because because like when I'm speaking to someone, they'll take me more seriously. Like also like our board kind of instructed us to take down our graduation years and our ages from the internet. um, so it definitely plays a role, but half the population is under 30. Half the global population is under 30. So young people are a very large proportion of the world. And so, it's really important. If half the population is that young, then there's really a strong need for them to be in leadership roles, because like that's a huge constituency that's not really adequately being represented, whether it's in companies or in governments and in parliaments, um, or in the leadership of the nonprofit sector.
Yeah. And I mean, I think also in the sector that you're in, right? Like we need some new approaches and different ways of thinking. So experience is a great thing, but it's also, in this case, clearly we want to change things and improve them. So a fresh mindset is probably very useful. Yeah. And I just love that you have a very specific mission. And I think that's often the key to success at the end. Sometimes you need to find it, and this is true in the startup world too. Sometimes you have to flare, but then eventually you have to focus. And I think you guys have sort of found your flaring phase is over a long time ago. You found your focus, and that's really beautiful. And with that, what do you see? Like, if somebody could give you, like, you could wave a magic wand and have one wish fulfilled as it relates to Climate Cardinals. What would be the thing that you feel like would be the greatest next step, something that would be super useful?
For the organization or for the world?
First, for the organization. I'm getting to the other point in a moment.
Um, for the organization, that's a great question. I mean, honestly, I think every nonprofit leader would just tell you that like more financial resources really to ensure that we're compensating our youth and really be like able to stay in this organization for the long term, because sometimes these things take a while, but then like when eventually like you're able to change mindsets and also policy, like it has a huge effect like all across the board. And so yeah, if I wave a magic wand, I think that's probably what I would ask for, and probably 90% of people who work in the nonprofit sector would ask for.
Fair enough. And and now we get to kind of the like the global climate movement, and everything that's involved. And I really mean like also there's the activists, there's the corporate initiatives, there's so much to it. Um, what do you think currently? I mean, I know there are so many big challenges. There's so much happening. What do you think? Yeah, what is kind of if it's kind of a similar question, but like, what would you say is like the one thing that, or what would be a thing? It can be more than one thing, maybe two, but which kind of dominoes would you like to see fall, right? So that like you see, um, yeah, like positive change happening or accelerating. What do you think are the most important points that we need to hit to accelerate the progress towards a more sustainable future?
Great question. Yeah, no, I mean, I think there are a lot of parts to it. To your point of having multiple answers, I think that there is a lot to be optimistic about. I mean, even like in the U.S., like even without like very strong involvement from the federal government, like still on track to achieve 75% of the Paris Agreement, and of course the 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius threshold are just thresholds. I mean, there are communities that are being impacted right now, but there's still a lot going on. Also outside of the U.S., like there are many places where like climate movements, or people who've come from the climate movement, are now leading governments, whether it's Canada or Mexico.
Hmm.
I mean, the Italian government, even though you might not think of them as traditionally very supportive of the climate movement, like they're the only government in the world that has specific funding for youth-led climate organizations and youth-led solutions.
Cool.
And so there's a lot going on. There are also a lot of solutions, and so now it's primarily a matter of moving capital. I mean, unfortunately, there's enough philanthropy in the world to actually achieve like everything that we need, but then actually moving capital towards these solutions, because there's so much going on all fronts. And once we really invest in them, like we'll be able to accelerate. the clean energy transition. And so I think part of it is, moving capital. Another part of it is communications. So really rebuilding momentum for climate by speaking about the opportunities there are for all of us, really, because you're creating new jobs, stronger connections to the environment, like better mental health through those connections, better health outcomes. Um, and there's so much to be gained. And so making sure that we're speaking about climate through that lens and also speaking to people who have not traditionally been spoken to. And so, I mean, I think part of the issue in the past has been that when people speak about climate communications, like they go to young people, which is great. Please come to us. Like we're happy to help. But I can't speak to everyone. Not everyone will relate to me, and so really identifying people who are trusted in their communities and empowering communicators who have that level of trust, who will be really able to move the needle. And then another part of it is finance for adaptation. So right now, about 7% of climate philanthropy goes towards adaptation. Climate philanthropy is about 2% of overall philanthropy. And of course, there's this huge issue where their very basic systems have not been set up that could save tons of lives and also reduce damage to property. So early warning systems are a huge issue, especially in a lot of communities where in a lot of communities that are disproportionately affected, where basically right now there is no infrastructure, and that is, I mean, both a business opportunity and also a philanthropic one. And so that's something where even if we were to immediately transition to a net zero economy, there still would be impacts from climate to come. So basically, more capital, better climate communications, empowering trusted communicators, and more support for climate adaptation. Oh, and then I also have to mention language access, of course.
Yeah, of course. And I mean, I think, and that's part of communication in a way, right? I think to exist, to effectively communicate, it's about how you message, but it's also about the message being able to be received by everybody. No, I love these points. And I'm going to plug this for a moment, but that is the funny thing is that I think the idea that there is opportunity in climate action is essentially that's Orgify's business case. And it's not only through the investments and or by or us basically helping companies to get rid of the headache that is the regulation, which is an important regulation. But to just to help with that, I think again, I think the point of communication there is so important, and this is where I feel like we can learn so much from you and your organization. Because if you think about it a little bit abstractly, I think this is sort of the quagmire for so many people in this space, right? Like we all know what we mean, but it's really difficult to communicate it to the right audience in the right way. So I think it's super, super interesting. And it brings me a little bit to this point that you touched on really briefly earlier too. The lack of information, that is in a way that's information. Data is information, right?
Yeah.
And research essentially produces data and information. Can you talk a little bit more about how important the work is that you're doing with your organization, with really with regard to the spread of scientific information?
Yeah, of course. I mean, basically, most scientific information is not translated. It's only in English. It's a huge issue in terms of access, also in terms of trust. Um, and then also because when there is access to that scientific information, oftentimes it's secondhand or it's third hand. Maybe it's coming from, it's been filtered through a lot, and you're not really able to access the original materials. It's also an issue because part of the imbalance is that a lot of the research is coming from English-speaking institutions and not coming from institutions that are closer to communities. So it's very distant to a lot of people. It also means that sometimes the quality of research is not as good, especially when it comes to data on climate risk. Like there are a lot of Microsoft has a project, for example, that's focused on empowering data scientists in Africa to lead projects in climate. So this is a very big opportunity, and also to address this broader imbalance in terms of where research is coming from. So it's issue of access, and part of the issue, and that issue of access is very much tied into the imbalance of where research is coming from, the quality of the research, for these communities.
And now I'm going on a limit. You can tell me if you know if how familiar you are with it. But like, have you sort of gotten into this world about where we talk about open source and open data? Because this is kind of where in the sphere where we work, where I think the example that you just mentioned, there being some initiatives that empower data scientists in Africa, for example. That's super useful. And I think the other part of the equation is this open source thing because it actually gives the chance to. Yeah, I'll let you talk.
Yeah, I mean, I have some limited involvement in the area. So I used to work with the UN Environment Programme's Finance Initiative on climate risk, and so basically, I was producing research reports for like national banks, about like issues with data, and climate risk, and so I could very much see like how our issue of language access is very much also tied into issues around the availability of data, the quality of data, and also how important open source data is, because anyone can use it, like for their own purposes. That's also something that we're thinking about in a very different way when it comes to machine translations. And so the issue right now is that how a lot of AI models are developed is, of course, a lot of companies are going to these regions and they're paying people like low amounts of money to basically train the tools. But then the tools are more designed for people like us to use them, in the U.S. and in Sweden, and part of the issue is that like there isn't as much investment in like communities creating tools for themselves that are actually useful for them. So something that we've been looking into is that how can we partner with tech companies, because we have this very broad network, 71% of our chapters in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, and like how can we provide them like financial support, and also access to like open source like code, so that basically they can train AI tools that can, like, for example, provide information about upcoming extreme weather events, like how to prepare, and provide like additional like localized information on like climate policies and how you can get involved.
I'm gonna jump that gun a little bit because I'm super like this just made me think of something. The way we've been talking about a little bit from both sides, but especially right, like essentially the information to the people needs to be in a way where they can understand it. But I'm also just had this thought now that you were saying all of this. Um, in this age of AI, right? You were talking a little bit about where it's sourcing the information from, and in the end, the information comes from some online sources, right? Not only the way that the AI is designed, but even if it would be democratically or evenly sourcing from, I'm actually it's just the thought that popped up. It's like, what is the language distribution like percentage wise of the internet, like of information on the internet, and then in the relevant, right? And of course, when we're talking about research, you've already sort of answered that question. But even more broadly speaking, I have like no answer to this question, but it's just something that made me think, and it when I'm thinking of it from the research and the data perspective, and we're saying that the vast majority of that is in English and comes from English speaking institutions, it's sort of a it's sort of like an exponential effect or something like that, because we're talking about, it is already true that the information is tailored towards English speaking audiences, and it comes from primarily those sort of research. So it's like the data provider needs to be spread more evenly, or the data providing space needs to be spread more evenly. Um, yeah, that's interesting. I'm just gonna let that sink in, and if you want to say something about it, um,
Yeah,
jump in.
yeah. I mean, I don't know the exact statistics for the overall internet, but I think it's something like 51% is in English,
Mm,
which is still, and like most prominent organizations will have their websites in English,
yeah,
and only like very big multinationals will actually translate their website into different languages. And then part of the issue too is the digital divide. And so, I mean, there are a lot of communities in which, yeah, like they don't have access to the internet, they don't have access to computers, and of course, that also influences like how much information is online, and what tools can be trained on. And so, yeah, that's a huge issue in machine translation, where the majority of funding is going primarily into 10 languages, and there are all these low resource languages, or they're called low resource languages because there's not as much data for them, where the tools are not the best, but also for that reason, like it probably could have like a very significant impact if you're actually able to get it out into communities because of all this information that hasn't been accessible to them. And also like, I mean, it's an issue in terms of access to like health information and climate information, but it's also an issue in terms of cultural heritage. So, for example, like if you have a very strong incentive to use other languages, like you might have to learn other languages, especially if you're working in a job that requires you to interact at a national level or regional level. And so yeah, it's a fascinating and very large issue that is something that a lot of people who work in machine translation, and we are also speaking about.
I'm gonna ask you. Sorry, did you want to add something?
No, no, no.
Okay. I'm gonna ask you a super broad question, and I'm gonna let you like take it in any direction you want. How do you see like AI and machine learning shape the whole climate movement, right? So there is the translation element, but like take it wherever you like. Like, what do you think are going to be some of the impacts that are happening, how it is shaping it, and where it might go?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we're in a very transformative moment for the world. I mean, I think as everyone is saying, and I think on our end, what seems clear to us is that there will be an AI revolution, like it's already started, um, and we can do our best to like push companies to ensure that they're reducing the emissions um, of data centers and the environmental impact of data centers, and a lot of companies have been doing that. While also realizing that there's a huge opportunity to apply AI to really accelerate climate solutions, and how yeah, I mean, this is actually probably a very small percentage of the overall use of AI, and that also there are other ways in which we can leverage AI for good while also regulating it, or not say regulating it, but also pointing out how there might be some uses um, that might not be as necessary. So, for example, like we've been speaking to a lot of policymakers, and a lot of them point out that there are websites in which AI is automatically integrated, and you might not actually like need to use it. So, for example, if you're looking up something, like an AI tool might pop up, and you might, and like that might be causing emissions. It might be causing a lot of emissions because people are always trying to do these things. And so that's something that I know has been taking place, like conversations have been taking place in the policy world. But when it comes to climate solutions, like it's already made such a huge difference. I mean, in terms of translations, like yeah, we've been able to quadruple our capacity per year. I know that for climate scientists, it's been huge in terms of just strengthening the quality of data, which of course is very important when it comes to yeah understanding how the climate works, like whether I mean, of course, there's still a lot of uncertainty in terms of when we might meet thresholds that might cause warming to accelerate, but also really helps in terms of like predicting like weather patterns, preparing communities for natural disasters, and so basically, like we've seen a lot of potential, and so there's a very strong opportunity to use it to accelerate what we've all already been doing and to really like use our creative perspective from all different sectors of the climate movement to transform the world and solutions for people.
And then and this is already in this hour that we've discussed. I understand this answer is already spread all over, but I'm looking for sound bites, and so I like to sometimes just like come back to in this age of AI and technology, right? Like we're talking about the role of technology in the climate movement, specific to your organization. How would you say that your work is helping to bridge this gap with of data accessibility um, that exists right now? And I know you've already talked about this, but if I asked a question like this, how does Climate Cardinals contribute?
Yeah, so we basically break language barriers for the global majority of 6.5 billion non-English speakers, but very limited access to climate information and data. Oftentimes, if they do have access, it's secondhand or third hand. And then there's also the huge issue where a lot of these communities have ideas and solutions, but they actually haven't been translated or resourced. And by really platforming the work that they're doing in different languages, we can hopefully also mobilize capital and philanthropy towards their ideas, and also more support for research on the ground that comes from these communities that actually know what's going on the best in their regions. And so for us, we're here to break language barriers and ensure that there can be climate resilience for all. And so that's what we're working on every day. And we're here for the long term to make sure that this happens.
Thank you for that. And then the other, and maybe there was already a similar one in there, but I just wanted to have it. And one of the things that is that I think is having quite a momentum, luckily, one issue in the climate movement and also even on the corporate side. So, for instance, now in the methodologies when we talk about ARR, so afforestation, reforestation, and revegetation projects in the markets, for example, right? So if somebody wants to invest in these ARR projects, an issue that comes up now, and I talked to Carl Burkhardt about this before too, is actually to respect not only indigenous lands, but also I think there is an awakening to understand that there is a lot to learn from indigenous voices, their understanding of the environment that they very much live in balance with often. Um, can you talk a little bit about this opportunity to give voice to indigenous communities in the climate movement and also in conjunction with the rise of technology?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think there's a very strong opportunity to really invest in indigenous communities, their ideas, their solutions. Um, like they have been, or like they have their own like ways of understanding the world, their own knowledge systems that they've had for centuries, and so there's a lot to learn. And traditionally, a lot of this hasn't really been taken up within global policy discussions. And so like I mean, today, like indigenous people who are about 5% of the global population help preserve about 80% of global biodiversity. And so basically, they've been doing this for centuries. They've been doing it well. And so it's important to platform them. And in terms of how technology can support their work, there are a lot of very innovative ways in which Indigenous communities have been leveraging technology. There's there's this one project out of university. I can't remember which university it's out of, but it's called Indigenous AI. And it's basically like a cohort of like indigenous like coders who've been using it in different ways. Like there's one example of a researcher based at Oxford who built tools for like conserving indigenous languages and also environmental knowledge. And then there are also like different ways in which it can be used for storytelling or for or for like being able to like to ensure that like their tools like when you're producing like research like information research summaries that you're also incorporating perspectives other than the ones that are from more traditional research universities and scientists, which of course I mean are very important, but also are have been represented in these global policy discussions. And so basically, I think that really supporting and investing in indigenous communities, their knowledge systems, platforming them is one of the greatest opportunities to really reshape global governance and to really bring in new ideas that work for the environment and for the world.
Thank you so much for that. I think this is a very important point. Yeah. So, um, so we've sort of talked about the role of technology. We've learned a lot about your organization and the work that you do. Um, yeah, like is there anything that you would like to add? Any kind of points that you feel are important to mention that maybe we haven't touched on, or maybe we sort of just tickled but didn't fully get into?
No, I mean, I just want to emphasize like how important it is to have discussions across sectors, and the role that actually a lot of companies can play in really like setting culture internally. Because I mean, there are these startups, these big multinationals that have global communities within them, and so you really have a large footprint and a very strong ability to like influence people within the organization, but also like through them also make an impact on the communities that they're working in and that they live in. And so companies have a huge role to play when it comes to conscious business and sustainability, um, of course. But there's also a great opportunity to come together with the nonprofit sector and just other industries to make sure that we understand each other, that we can partner with each other, that we can platform like solutions in either sector that's working, and to really build trust, so that we can rebuild momentum for climate solutions.
And then I have two more on the personal or in the individual level questions for you. One is, now you gave a really good, I think, good advice, honestly, for corporates, and for everybody in the sector, like all the big stakeholders, how to work together. Um, but your story, this is kind of the arch back to the beginning. It's also a story of like early engagement. I think you said community organizing at 11 or something like that, right?
Yeah.
Um, but we know we'll have listeners of all kinds of age groups, hopefully. And I'm curious. I mean, there's so much inspiring stuff in your story. I, for some people that might also give the, wow, he's 24, he's done all these things, like, and here I'm sitting, right? Like, it's easy to give up too. What is your advice, just in general to people, like, how do you identify your path, how you can contribute, I guess, is the question.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I feel like oftentimes it's right in front of you. Like you see an issue within your community or your workplace, um, and oftentimes because you're there every day, like how to deal with it, or you can start to think about it, or you can bring it up. And so, I mean, that's what happened with us, right? We saw it in our own families and our own communities. And so, yeah, we weren't professional translators, but we started to think about how can we actually do something about this. And I think just like the very I think just realizing how important it was just kept us going every day. And also, I mean, there have been times where I'm like, yeah, this is hard. Of course, running an organization is hard. Growing an organization is hard. And trying to stay in the organization in the long term is also hard. So it's not easy, but um, nothing worthwhile is usually easy. And so I think it's just been so exciting to yeah, to keep on learning, to keep on growing, and also it's so important to like make sure that we're building community and keeping each other in a good headspace because we need all of us involved, and so it's important that we keep all of us involved.
Yeah, I hear also from that. I also hear like open your eyes, like maybe it's right there, and you maybe it's right. Yeah, like you said, it's totally right in front of you sometimes. Um, the other thing, and that's the question that I alluded to earlier, right? And I think it is a nice question, and I ask everybody who comes on the podcast. Um, what is something that you're proudest of, and like what would you say is like the accomplishment, or something that has given you the most fulfillment?
I can't say it's a single thing. I'd say that something that like I have to pinch myself every day is just that we were a group of high school students with $500, some cool classroom accounts, a very basic Squarespace website that might have looked like it was a scam, and we came together and built movement where now there are people in 134 countries and we're receiving stories and videos from people in places that we've never been to. And it just astonishing, just amazing to see what's possible. Yeah, when you identify issue, when you communicate it, and when you try to bring people together to make a better world. And so, yeah, I think just the biggest accomplishment has just been like, yeah, this like collective movement we've been able to build like across countries, across sectors, across languages, that will hopefully continue for the long term or for as long as possible, until we're able to end language exclusion, and ensure that every community is climate resilient.
Amazing. I really appreciate that. And I really wish you all the best going forward. I hope that the people listening to this, at the very least, can take some inspiration. I think it's very much needed. And it's also beautiful to see that it is very much actually in place. Good things are happening, and you're one of the faces of it. So I think that's great, and it's just amazing. I think to learn a lot of things from people that have been on this planet a lot shorter than yourself. So that's also something super inspiring and really cool. Um, yeah, I really appreciate your time, and I want to thank you for that. You can stick around for a second after I stop recording. But yeah, I'll give you like the last word if there's anything left for you to say.
Yeah, no, well, no, I mean, I'm sure yeah, you're 24, right? No, it's no, but no, thank you so much for having me. It was great. Really enjoyed the conversation. Also, like, feel free to reach out to us or to me personally or to Climate Cardinals. We're always happy to collaborate and to learn from other people in this space.